On the evening of the 24th of December, 2006, a man named Rowan Greer and his 14-year-old son Ellis left their house on Birchfield Road in Callaway, Kentucky at 6:45 in the morning, put 2 suitcases in the trunk of their gray Buick LeSabre, and drove toward Louisville International Airport to catch a 7:50 flight to visit Rowan's sister in Portland, Oregon, for Christmas. They did not check in for the flight. The gate agent remembered the reservation because it was a last-minute booking made the previous afternoon and because the names had been called twice at boarding and had not appeared, which on Christmas Eve was unusual enough to register. The airline's records confirmed the reservation and confirmed the no-show. The credit card charge for the tickets, placed on Rowan Greer's Visa card at 2:17 in the afternoon on December 23rd, was the last transaction the card ever recorded. The Buick LeSabre was found on the 27th of December in the long-term parking structure at Louisville International Airport, Level 3, Bay 41, parked between a minivan and a concrete pillar with a parking ticket tucked under the wiper blade, dated the 24th of December at 7:12 in the morning. The trunk contained the 2 suitcases, still packed. The car was locked. The keys were not inside the car and were not found in the parking structure or anywhere on the airport grounds. Rowan Greer was 46 years old. He had been a high school mathematics teacher at Callaway Regional High for 16 years. He was described by his colleagues as steady and deliberate, and by his students as the kind of teacher who made difficult things legible by the quality of his patience. He had been divorced from Ellis's mother, a woman named Sandra Greer, who had remarried and lived in Columbus, Ohio, for 7 years. He had primary custody of Ellis. He had a sister in Portland, Martha Vane, who had been expecting them for Christmas and who had called the airline and then Rowan's cell phone and then the Callaway Police Department on the afternoon of December 24th when neither Rowan nor Ellis had appeared and neither was answering. Ellis Greer was 14 years old. He was in the 9th grade. His teachers described him as quiet and mathematically gifted in the way that the sons of mathematics teachers sometimes were, the aptitude absorbed from a household organized around the love of numbers. He played guitar badly and cheerfully, which his music teacher noted was more valuable than playing well without either quality. He had been looking forward to Portland, his aunt having promised him a visit to Powell's books, which he had been researching online for 3 weeks. They were never found. For 17 years, the case remained in the open cold case files of the Callaway Police Department and the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, which had assumed joint jurisdiction over the airport-adjacent portion of the investigation in the weeks following the discovery of the Buick in the parking structure. 17 years of periodic review and periodic dormancy and periodic anniversary coverage and the sustained, quiet devastation of a woman named Sandra Greer in Columbus, who had lost a child to the particular limbo of an unresolved disappearance, and who had never remarried, and who kept Ellis's school photograph on the mantelpiece of her living room in the same position it had occupied since the day a police officer had come to her door 4 days after Christmas. In the autumn of 2023, a former employee of Louisville International Airport named Vic Dallow died in a hospice facility outside Louisville and left behind, in a locked strongbox delivered to his estranged daughter by the hospice social worker per his written instructions, a collection of materials that his daughter did not know what to do with and that she brought to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department on a Thursday morning in November because the social worker had told her that if the contents concerned her, she should go to law enforcement rather than elsewhere. The contents concerned her. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Department opened the case. This is the story of Rowan Greer and Ellis Greer, a father and his son who put suitcases in a trunk on a Christmas Eve morning and drove toward an airport and parked the car and locked it and never came back for it. And what a dying man left in a strongbox because he had lacked the courage to say it while he was living and had found, in the arrangement of his final affairs, the only form of saying it that his courage had been equal to. Subscribe now. Because what was in that strongbox is not a confession, it is something more complicated and more terrible. Callaway, Kentucky. Population 22,400. Situated in the western reach of the state where the land flattened from the hill country of the central Kentucky Plateau toward the river bottom lands of the western coal fields. the geography of a region that had organized itself across 2 centuries around the parallel economies of agriculture and small manufacturing, and the particular civic culture of county seat towns that served as administrative and commercial centers for the rural communities surrounding them. The town had a courthouse with a Civil War monument on its front lawn, and a main street that retained enough of its original commercial character to feel intentional rather than accidental, and a school district that employed, in December of 2006, 112 teachers, of whom one was a mathematics teacher named Rowan Greer, who had taught in that district for 16 years and who had never been absent without notice, and who had submitted his holiday absence paperwork in the standard form on the 20th of December. Birchfield Road was a residential street of the kind that Callaway produced in its post-war suburban expansions, houses of modest but individually maintained character, set back from the road behind front lawns that the street's homeowners tended with the quiet pride of people for whom the visible condition of the exterior of a house communicated something about the invisible condition of the life inside it. Number 37 was a 2-story colonial with white shutters and a covered porch, whose condition reflected the attentiveness of a person who had been maintaining it alone for 7 years, without allowing the aloneness of the maintenance to become visible in the maintenance's quality. Rowan Greer had lived at 37 Birchfield Road since 2001, the year he and Sandra had separated, and the house had been transferred to his name as part of the division of their shared life into its individual components. He had raised Ellis there across the primary custody years, the kitchen table where Ellis did homework, and the back garden where Ellis had progressed from childhood games to the adolescent solitude of a boy who found in the outdoor space of the garden a room of his own within the shared house. The neighbors on both sides knew Rowan by the quality of his morning greeting and his habit of shoveling snow from the sidewalk in front of the adjacent properties, as well as his own. A small and unrequested generosity that the neighbors on both sides had noted and had never thanked him for in the formal sense, because the frequency of it had made it seem like something that simply happened rather than something that a specific person chose to do. The morning of December 24th had been cold and clear in the particular way of a Kentucky Christmas Eve that had been promised snow and had not yet received it. The sky a pale gray above the frost-whitened lawns, and the temperature at 6:30 in the morning at 17 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that the Buick's engine had needed 2 minutes of idling before Rowan had loaded the suitcases, cold enough that the neighbor across the street, a retired postal worker named Carl Beach, who was an early riser and who had been returning from his mailbox at 6:50, had seen the Buick's exhaust steaming in the cold air and had waved at the car as it backed out of the drive and had seen Rowan's hand raised in return through the rear window. Carl Beach was the last person known to have seen Rowan and Ellis Greer. He had told this to the Callaway Police Department on the 27th of December and had told it to every subsequent investigator who had asked, and had thought about it with the persistent and unresolvable regret of a man who had waved at a car on a cold December morning and had not known that the waving was the last time, and who had continued, across 17 years, to pass 37 Birchfield Road on his morning walk, and to look at the house with the same expression that he had tried to describe to 3 different investigators across those years, and that no investigator had been able to find a more accurate word for than witness. The strongbox Vic Dallow left behind contained, his daughter would tell the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, enough to explain what she had never been able to explain in 17 years of having a vague and unnameable feeling that the airport where she had worked as a baggage handler for 11 years had something to do with 2 people who had parked a gray Buick in its long-term lot on Christmas Eve and had not come back for it. She had never known what her father knew. She had only known the feeling. The strongbox was the difference between the feeling and the knowing. Vera Boone had spent 11 years writing about cold cases with the specific focus that distinguished her work from the broader category of true crime journalism, which was the focus on the institutional and systemic failures that allowed cases to remain cold rather than on the cases themselves as narratives of individual horror. She was 43 years old and had published 3 books whose argument, sustained across all 3, was that cold cases were rarely cold because the truth was unreachable, but frequently cold because the institutional architecture of the investigation had been organized in ways that made the truth difficult to approach. the silos of jurisdiction, and the limitations of available technology at the time of the original investigation, and the specific human tendency to accept the first available explanation that fit the known facts rather than pursuing the explanation that the full set of facts, including the facts the investigation had not yet found, would eventually support. She had tracked the Greer case since 2009, 3 years after the disappearance, when she had read a brief item about the third anniversary of the no-show at the Louisville gate, and had noted the case in her working database under the notation she reserved for cases in which the physical evidence of the parking structure placement was inconsistent with the voluntary departure hypothesis in a way the investigation had not fully resolved. The locked car in the long-term lot, the keys missing from the car and from the airport grounds, the suitcases still in the trunk, Christmas gifts wrapped inside them, confirmed by the original investigation's inventory of the luggage contents. The parking ticket showing a 7:12 arrival, which was 38 minutes before the flight's departure. The arrival time of a person who intended to catch the flight, and not the arrival time of a person who had decided, between leaving home and reaching the airport, not to. She had been in Nashville working on a piece about an unrelated case when the item about the strongbox appeared in the Jefferson County online news aggregator on a Friday in November, a brief and carefully worded item from the Sheriff's Department's Public Information Office that confirmed a new development in the Greer cold case and stated that the department was actively investigating without providing further detail. The item was 3 sentences. The third sentence said the development was connected to the death of a former airport employee. Vera read the item twice and was in Louisville by Saturday morning. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Department had assigned the reopened case to Detective Lieutenant Carol Fenn, a 48-year-old investigator with 20 years in the department who had worked the original Greer investigation as a junior detective in 2007 and who had the institutional memory of the case in the specific form that it existed for people who had been present at the beginning of an unresolved case and who had carried it in the peripheral awareness of their professional consciousness across the years of its dormancy, occasionally returning to it in the way that investigators returned to cases that had not resolved in a way their instincts found satisfactory. Fenn had not been satisfied with the voluntary departure hypothesis that the original investigation had eventually settled on in the absence of evidence supporting any other explanation, a hypothesis that required accepting that a 46-year-old mathematics teacher with primary custody of a 14-year-old son had parked a car in an airport long-term lot on Christmas Eve, removed the keys, locked the car, left the suitcases, including the wrapped Christmas presents in the trunk, and walked away from his son's Portland visit and his sister's Christmas and his 16 years of professional reliability and his maintained house on Birchfield Road without leaving any trace of why or where. She had been sitting in her office with the original case file open on her desk when Vic Dallow's daughter arrived at the department on the Thursday morning, and she had received the strongbox and its contents with the professional composure of someone who had been waiting for a development in this case for 16 years and who had decided, long since, that when the development arrived, she was going to receive it without the performance of composure, but with the actual composure that 16 years of professional patience had built. The strongbox was a standard commercial strongbox of the type available at hardware stores and office supply retailers, steel construction with a 3-digit combination lock that Vic Dallow's daughter had not known the combination to and that the department's locksmith had opened in 4 minutes. Inside were 3 items: a sealed envelope, a USB drive of the type that had been common in the mid-2000s, its casing yellowed slightly with age, and a folded sheet of paper on which Vic Dallow had written, in a hand that the handwriting analysis unit would subsequently describe as showing the motor control deterioration consistent with the late stages of the Parkinson's disease that the hospice records confirmed had been his terminal diagnosis, a single sentence. The sentence read, "I did not do this, but I knew about it, and I am sorry that I did not say so, and the envelope and the drive will tell you who did." Fenn had read the sentence in the evidence room with her gloves on and the chain of custody documentation complete, and she had set the paper down and looked at it for a moment before calling the State Bureau's Digital Forensics Unit about the USB drive and the department's laboratory about the envelope. She had also called Vera Boone, whose work she had encountered in the context of 2 previous investigations and whose presence in Louisville she had confirmed through the department's public information request log, Vera having submitted a standard media inquiry to the PIO office on Saturday morning. Fenn had a policy of proactive contact with journalists whose track record she considered consistent with the responsible handling of information in active investigations, a policy that her supervisor considered unusual and that the 2 previous cases had validated in the way of policies that produced better outcomes than their alternatives. Vera met her at the department on a Monday morning. They sat in the conference room where the strongbox contents had been laid out in the organized evidence display of an active investigation, each item in its evidence bag with its chain of custody documentation attached, and Fenn briefed Vera on what the weekend's preliminary work had produced. The envelope had contained a 4-page handwritten letter in Vic Dallow's deteriorated hand, composed over what the letter's internal evidence suggested had been multiple sessions across the final weeks of his life, the handwriting varying in its legibility from session to session in the way of a degenerative motor condition whose progression affected the production of the handwriting differently on different days. The letter described, in the careful and incomplete way of a man who was communicating the minimum necessary for someone else to find what they needed to find while withholding the full account that his courage, even at the end, was not equal to providing, the circumstances of December 24, 2006. As Vic Dallow had understood them from a position inside the airport's operational infrastructure that the public-facing operations of the airport did not make visible. He had been a maintenance supervisor. His access to the airport's non-public spaces, the service corridors and the utility areas and the sub-terminal infrastructure that the airport's operational requirements generated and that the traveling public never saw, had been comprehensive in the way of a senior maintenance supervisor whose role required him to be able to go anywhere in the building at any hour with a legitimate operational reason for the going. He had held the position for 9 years at the time of the Greer disappearance. He had known the non-public spaces of Louisville International Airport with the intimate and granular knowledge of someone who had spent 9 years ensuring that those spaces functioned correctly and who had developed, across that time, the complete spatial and operational understanding of the airport's full physical extent that his professional responsibility required. He had also known, the letter said in its careful and incomplete way, a man who had worked in the airport's contract maintenance operations, a man whose access to the same non-public spaces was a function of the contract arrangement that provided the airport with supplementary maintenance capacity during peak periods, of which the Christmas travel season was the most significant, and whose presence in the airport's service corridors and utility areas during the peak period was routine and unremarkable, and institutionally invisible in the specific way that contract workers were institutionally invisible in large facilities whose regular workforce interacted with contractors as a background feature of the operational environment, rather than as specific individuals whose presence required specific attention. The man's name was in the letter. It was also, Fenn said, on the USB drive, whose contents the digital forensics unit had extracted and reviewed over the weekend, the drive containing a collection of digital files that Vic Dallow had assembled and preserved across the years since 2006 in the way of a person who had been collecting evidence of something they could not bring themselves to formally report, and who had organized the evidence with the care of someone who understood that its eventual use depended on its completeness and its integrity. She told Vera the name and said it was being actively pursued through every available database, and that the investigation was in its early active stage and that she was sharing the name now because Vera's research capacity and her knowledge of the case's history made her a potential source of information about the name that the investigation needed, and because the information exchange between them was more productive when it was bidirectional than when it was the standard asymmetric flow of investigative findings to journalism with nothing flowing in return. Vera wrote the name in her notebook. She looked at it for a moment. The name was not in her existing case files or in her database of Southwest and Midwest disappearance cases, which she had spent 11 years building into a comprehensive reference. It was a new name, unconnected to any of the cases she had previously researched, the name of a person who had existed in a specific institutional context, a contract maintenance worker in the non-public spaces of a regional airport. in a way that the institutional invisibility of that context had sustained across 17 years of an investigation that had not known the context existed. She asked Fenn what the USB drive contained beyond the name. Fenn said the drive contained photographs and a partial log. She said the photographs were being analyzed and that the log was being reviewed by the handwriting unit, cross-referenced against Vic Dallow's confirmed handwriting, and that the preliminary assessment was consistent with Dallow having compiled the drive's contents across a period beginning in 2007, 1 year after the disappearance, and extending through approximately 2015, at which point the drive's modification dates showed no further additions. She said the log was partial in the sense that it documented observations rather than events, the record of a maintenance supervisor who had noticed specific things in specific locations across the non-public spaces of the airport over the period covered, and who had documented those observations without documenting the full context that would have made them immediately legible as evidence of the specific event they were adjacent to. She said the photographs were more legible. She said she would share the photographs with Vera when the forensic analysis was complete, and the sharing would not compromise the active investigation's operational requirements. Vera thanked her and left the conference room and walked to the parking lot and sat in her car in the Louisville November, the Kentucky sky low and gray above the city in the specific way of late autumn in the upper South when the seasonal change had arrived in the sky before it had fully arrived in the temperature, and the landscape had the particular quality of a place that was between its summer self and its winter self and had not yet committed to either. She thought about a mathematics teacher and his 14-year-old son putting suitcases in a trunk on a cold December morning and driving toward an airport. She thought about a parking ticket at 7:12 and a 7:50 flight that had called 2 names and received no response. She thought about a gray Buick LeSabre locked in a long-term parking structure for 3 days before anyone came looking, and about Carl Beach raising his hand at a mailbox and seeing a hand raised in return through a rear window, and about Powell's books in Portland that Ellis had been researching for 3 weeks. She thought about a dying man and a strongbox and a single sentence on a folded piece of paper. I did not do this, but I knew about it, and I am sorry that I did not say so. She opened her notebook and wrote the name that Fenn had given her. Then she drew a line beneath it and wrote below the line the same question she always wrote at the beginning of the part of a case that had been cold and was now warm again, the question that the new name required. Who are you? The Louisville International Airport in December of 2006 had been, by the accounts of the people who worked there and the operational records that the Jefferson County investigation had obtained in the weeks following the strongbox discovery, an airport in the specific condition of a mid-sized regional facility during its annual peak operational period, the Christmas travel surge that transformed the measured daily rhythms of a medium traffic facility into the compressed and pressured operations of an environment processing 3 times its average passenger volume through infrastructure designed for the average rather than the peak. The Christmas surge brought contract workers. The airport's regular maintenance workforce was supplemented during the peak period by contract employees sourced through a facilities management company whose contract with the airport authority had been in place since 2003, and whose workers moved through the airport's non-public spaces during the peak periods, with the unremarkable presence of people whose role was to ensure that the public-facing infrastructure functioned correctly during the period when the volume of its use was greatest. They wore the same uniform category as the regular maintenance staff, the dark utility clothing with the airport authority's logo on the breast pocket. And they carried the same access credentials, the magnetic key cards that opened the service corridor doors and the utility area hatches and the sub-terminal infrastructure access points that the airport's operational requirements had seeded throughout the building's non-public geography. The contract supervisor for the 2006 Christmas surge was a man named Vic Dallow, who held the airport's senior maintenance supervisor position and whose responsibility for the contract workers' integration into the airport's operational structure was a function of his role and his comprehensive knowledge of the non-public spaces they would be working in. He had managed the Christmas surge contract integration for 5 consecutive years by 2006, which gave him the institutional familiarity with the process and the personnel that 5 years of repetition produced and that made him, by the accounts of his regular colleagues, the most operationally effective member of the maintenance leadership team during the period when operational effectiveness was most demanding. He had known the man named in his letter from the Christmas surge contract workforce across 3 previous years, 2003, 2004, and 2005, the man having appeared in the contract worker rosters for each of those years and having performed his assigned work with the unremarkable competence that made him a worker. Dallow did not think about specifically, but retained in the background awareness of a supervisor whose effectiveness depended on the comprehensive ambient knowledge of who was in his operational environment and what they were doing. In 2006, the man had not appeared on the Christmas surge contract roster. This was what Dallow's letter identified as the beginning of his concern, the absence of a familiar worker from a roster where his presence had been expected, followed by the observation that the absent worker was nonetheless present in the airport's non-public spaces during the surge period, present in the service corridors and the utility areas with the access credentials and the uniform that the contract workforce used, present without the operational paperwork that should have documented his presence, present in the specific and institutionally invisible way of someone who knew the non-public geography of the airport well enough from 3 years of legitimate access to navigate it without the documentation that legitimate access required. Dallow had noticed this. He had noticed it in the peripheral way of an experienced supervisor whose ambient awareness of his operational environment was comprehensive enough to register the absence from the roster alongside the presence in the corridors as an inconsistency that required attention. He had not given it the attention it required. He had been managing the surge and the surge's operational demands and the specific logistical pressures of a Christmas Eve whose passenger volume had exceeded the projected peak and whose regular maintenance staff were at the limit of their capacity to manage the resulting infrastructure demands. He had not given it the attention it required, and a father and his son had parked a gray Buick LeSabre in the long-term lot at 7:12 in the morning and had not come back for it. This was the architecture of the failure that Dallow's letter described, in the careful and incomplete language of a man who was communicating the minimum necessary rather than the full account. The architecture of a competent professional who had noticed the right thing and had not acted on the noticing in the time available for acting to produce a different outcome, and who had carried the knowledge of this across 17 years with the specific and private weight of a person who understood exactly what the not acting had cost and had chosen, across those 17 years, to carry the weight alone rather than in the company of the investigation that would have received it. Vera spent the first week in Louisville, building the contextual record that she always built before approaching the central material of an investigation, the layer of institutional and geographic understanding that gave the case its setting in the specific and granular way that documents and interviews alone could not provide. She walked the airport's public spaces with the attention of a journalist who was reading a building as well as using it, noting the layout and the access points and the visible indicators of the non-public infrastructure that the service corridor doors and the utility area signage communicated to anyone looking for them. She spoke to 3 former airport employees who had worked the 2006 Christmas surge and who had agreed to speak to her after she had identified herself and her work and had explained her interest in the Greer case with the transparency she always brought to initial contacts. 2 of the 3 were unhelpful in the specific way of people who had processed a long-ago event into the category of things that were part of the institutional past of a place they had worked, and that had no particular claim on their current attention. The third was a former gate agent named Donna Marsh, no relation to the Marsh family of any other case Vera had covered, who had been working the gate for the 7:50 Portland flight on December 24, 2006, and who had called the 2 names at boarding and had received no response, and who had been interviewed by the original investigation and had provided what she had to provide and had thought about it periodically across the subsequent years. She met Vera in the coffee shop adjacent to the airport's main terminal on a Tuesday morning and received her with the cooperative directness of a woman who had been waiting for the right conversation to arrive and who had calibrated her assessment of Vera's credibility within the first 2 minutes and found it sufficient. She said the 2 names at boarding had been called in the sequence of the seat assignments, which placed Greer and Greer together in the window and middle seats of row 14, and that the absence of both names had told her, in the experiential way of a gate agent who had been processing departure gates for 9 years by 2006, that the pair had not been separated in the terminal, that they had either both arrived or neither had arrived, and that the parking structure's confirmation of the car's presence meant neither had arrived at the gate despite having arrived at the airport. She said that in 9 years of gate work, she had seen passengers who had arrived at the airport fail to reach the gate for many reasons: medical emergencies and security screening detentions, and the simple navigational failures of people who had underestimated the distance from the parking structure to the gate in a terminal they were not familiar with. She said she had filed the Greer no-show in the category of one of those reasons on the day and had moved on through the departure in the way that the departure process required, and had revisited the filing when the police had arrived 3 days later and had found, in the revisiting, that none of the standard reasons had applied because none of them produced a locked car with the luggage still inside and no subsequent appearance of the 2 people who should have been in the seats. She said she had thought about row 14 of the Portland flight every Christmas Eve since 2006. Vera asked her whether she had noticed anything unusual about the airport on that specific morning, anything in the terminal or in the access areas that had registered as out of the ordinary in the ambient awareness of someone who knew the airport's operational rhythms well enough to notice deviations from them. Donna set her coffee down and looked at the table. She said she had been asked this question before and had given the same answer she was going to give now, which was that she had noticed one thing she had not been able to connect to anything specific and which she had included in her original statement, and which the investigating detective had written down and had not appeared to find significant. She had noticed a man in the service corridor adjacent to the gate area. She had noticed him because service corridor doors were in her peripheral visual field when she was at the gate podium, and because the service corridor doors opened periodically in the normal course of operations, and she had registered the openings as part of the ambient awareness of the space without paying them specific attention. She had registered this particular opening because the door had been open for a duration that exceeded the normal transit duration of a service corridor door. The door held open from the inside for a period she estimated at 3 to 4 minutes rather than the seconds of the normal transit. She had glanced at the corridor door. She had seen a man in the maintenance uniform of the airport's contract workforce standing in the corridor opening, not moving through it, but standing in it at the far end of the corridor's visible extent as seen from the gate podium, his body positioned at the angle of someone looking toward the gate area rather than someone in transit between 2 operational points. She had looked for approximately 3 seconds and had looked away because the departure process had required her attention and because a maintenance worker in a service corridor was not in itself a reason to interrupt the departure process. She had given this to the original investigation. The investigating detective had written it down. Vera wrote it in her notebook and looked at the description. The man in the maintenance uniform standing in the service corridor adjacent to the gate for 3 to 4 minutes, at an angle that placed his sight line toward the gate area rather than toward the operational destination of someone in transit. She thought about a contract worker who was not on the roster and who had been in the airport's non-public spaces on December 24th with access credentials and a uniform from 3 previous years of legitimate contract work, and who knew the non-public geography of the airport with the comprehensive knowledge of someone who had navigated it across 3 Christmas surge periods. She thought about the service corridor adjacent to the gate for the 7:50 Portland flight and about a man standing in it at the angle of someone watching something rather than moving towards something. She thought about row 14 and the 2 names called twice at boarding and receiving no response. She thought about a 14-year-old boy who had been researching Powell's books in Portland for 3 weeks. She closed her notebook and drove back to her motel through the Louisville November and sat at the desk with her laptop and began the background search on the name that Fenn had given her, the search that she always began with the public record databases before the investigation's formal resources produced the deeper layer that the public databases did not contain. She was 3 hours into the search when she found the first thing that made her set the laptop down and look at the wall for a moment before picking it up again and continuing. The name had a building trades employment history in Kentucky and the adjacent states running from the mid-1990s through the mid-2000s. The history documented the skills that a person who had known the airport's non-public infrastructure well enough to navigate it without operational documentation would have acquired in the course of the work the history described. And the employment history ended in 2007, 1 year after the Greer disappearance. At exactly the point in the timeline when, in other cases in other states, a name in an employment history had been shed and replaced by a different name in a different state, the identity modification methodology of a person who had learned to manage the documentary infrastructure of a life with the conscious intention of disposability. She looked at the end date of the employment history and at the name above it, and she thought about Fenn's conference room and the strongbox and the sentence on the folded paper, and about the building trades and the non-public spaces of airports, and about 17 years of a locked Buick in a parking structure and a woman named Sandra Greer in Columbus who kept a school photograph on a mantelpiece. She opened a new page in her notebook and wrote the employment end date and drew a line beneath it. Then she began to look for what came after. The USB drive's contents, as fully extracted and analyzed by the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department's Digital Forensics Unit by the second week of November, comprised 47 files organized in a folder structure that Vic Dallow had created with the deliberate and careful architecture of a person who had been assembling evidence across 8 years and who had understood that the evidence's eventual utility depended on its organization being legible to someone who had not been present for its compilation. The folder structure used date-based naming, the years from 2007 through 2015, each comprising a parent folder whose subfolders contained the files generated in that year. The whole structure constituting the digital record of a maintenance supervisor's sustained and private documentation of what he had known and had been unable to bring himself to report. The photographs numbered 31 across the 8 years. The earliest, dated February of 2007, 6 weeks after the Greer disappearance, showed a section of service corridor in the airport's sub-terminal level, photographed from the doorway of an adjacent utility room. The corridor's fluorescent-lit geometry of bare concrete wall and overhead pipe conduit rendered in the specific flat light of a space designed for function rather than visibility. And in the corridor, at a distance of approximately 15 feet from the camera, a man in the airport authority's maintenance uniform carrying a toolbox and moving away from the camera toward the junction at the corridor's far end. The photograph's composition communicated the specific quality of documentation produced by someone photographing something they were not supposed to be photographing. The camera angle slightly oblique and the framing slightly imprecise in the way of a photograph taken quickly rather than carefully. The photograph of a person using their phone in the manner of someone who needed a record and who was producing the record in the time available for producing it without the time available for producing it correctly. The man's face was not visible in the February photograph. His back was to the camera. His build was visible, medium height and compact in the specific way of a person whose work was physical and whose body had been shaped by the physical work across the years of doing it. And the maintenance uniform was visible in its detail. The dark utility clothing and the airport authority logo on the breast pocket and the toolbox carried in the right hand in the manner of someone who carried toolboxes habitually and had the specific hand positioning and arm angle of a person for whom the weight was familiar rather than effortful. The subsequent photographs across the 8 years showed the same man in the same corridor or in adjacent sections of the airport's sub-terminal infrastructure, always from behind or at angles that produced a partial face view rather than a direct one, always in the maintenance uniform, always carrying the operational equipment of a maintenance worker, the toolbox or the pipe wrench or the electrical testing equipment that the airport's infrastructure maintenance required. The quality of the photographs improved marginally across the 8 years as the phone cameras of the period improved. The later photographs sharper and better resolved than the earlier ones, though none of them producing the full frontal facial documentation that would have made the photographic record definitively useful as an identification tool. Except the last one. The last photograph, dated March of 2015, was different from the 30 preceding it in both its composition and its apparent circumstances of production. It was a full-face photograph, taken from behind a vehicle in a parking structure that the photograph's background details identified as the long-term lot of Louisville International Airport, the concrete pillar, and the lot numbering visible in the frame behind the figure. The man was walking toward the camera without awareness of the camera, his face fully illuminated by the parking structure's overhead lighting. His expression the neutral and focused expression of a person moving through a space toward a destination and carrying the operational awareness of the destination rather than the awareness of being observed. The photograph was clear enough for a facial recognition comparison. The Digital Forensics Unit had submitted it to the State Bureau's Facial Recognition Unit on the Monday following the drive's extraction, and the comparison result had arrived on the Wednesday, 2 days before Fenn had called Vera, and the result had been the finding that had caused Fenn to call Vera rather than waiting for the public information process to move at its standard pace. The facial recognition result had returned a match. Not a high-confidence match of the type that produced a direct identification, but a moderate confidence match of the type that directed an investigation toward a specific individual for further investigation. The match paired with a cross-reference from the State Bureau's Identity Modification Search Unit that had been working the Greer case's name chain since the strongbox delivery, and that had found in the 3 weeks of the name chain search the connection that the facial recognition result confirmed. The name in Dallow's letter was not the name at the end of the chain. It was a name in the middle of the chain, one of the identities the person had used during the period covered by the USB drive's documentation, the name attached to the contract maintenance work at Louisville International Airport during the Christmas surge periods of 2003 through 2005, and to the building trades employment history in Kentucky that Vera had found in her public database search. The name at the end of the chain, the most recent identity that the State Bureau's search had been able to establish, was a different name in a different state, and the facial recognition result from the March 2015 parking structure photograph had provided the visual bridge between the middle chain identity and the most recent one. Fenn shared the full photograph set with Vera on the Wednesday after the forensic review was complete, spreading the 47 files across the conference room table in the printed form that the forensic unit had produced for the investigation's physical record. Vera looked at each photograph in sequence, the 30 photographs of the corridor and the subterminal infrastructure, and then the final photograph of the parking structure, the full-face image that had produced the facial recognition match, and she looked at the face in the final photograph with the focused attention of someone who had been building the architecture of an investigation around a name and who was now seeing the face that the name belonged to for the first time. She thought the face was unremarkable. She wrote this in her notebook and then looked at the word unremarkable and thought about it for a moment before writing below it, in the smaller notation she used for observations that were trying to become thoughts. That unremarkable was the right word in the specific sense that the face did not communicate the character of the person behind it in any way that the face's surface alone would reveal, the face being organized in the way that certain faces were organized, with the features arranged to produce an impression of ordinariness that was itself a kind of camouflage, the specific neutrality of a face that had learned to give nothing away to anyone looking at it. She asked Fenn about the USB drive's log files. Fenn said the logs were partial in the sense she had described at their first meeting, the observations of a maintenance supervisor documented without the full contextual account that would have made them immediately legible as evidence, rather than as the record of a person who had noticed specific things without knowing what to do with the noticing. The logs covered the same period as the photographs, 2007 through 2015, and they documented in Dallow's deteriorating hand the observations he had made in the airport's non-public spaces across those years, the periodic presence of a person who should not have been there, present in the service corridors and the utility areas and the subterminal infrastructure with the access credentials and the uniform that had been legitimate 3 years earlier and that continued to function in the institutional environment of a large facility where the checking of credentials was less rigorous than the issuing of them. The logs noted the dates and the approximate times of the observations and the locations within the subterminal infrastructure where the observations had occurred. They noted the operational equipment carried on each occasion, the toolbox and the pipe wrench and the electrical testing equipment, and on 2 occasions separated by 3 years, a piece of equipment that Dallow had described in his log with the careful imprecision of someone who did not know the equipment's specific name, but who had recognized it as belonging to the category of digging and excavating tools rather than to the category of maintenance and repair tools that the other observed equipment belonged to. A spade on one occasion, a short-handled pick on the other. Vera set her pen down after writing spade and short-handled pick in her notebook and looked at the conference room table and thought about the sub-terminal infrastructure of a large airport, the spaces beneath and behind the public-facing operations, the utility rooms, and the service corridors and the access tunnels that connected the terminal's operational zones, the spaces that a maintenance supervisor's comprehensive knowledge of the building's non-public geography would encompass, and that a person with 3 years of legitimate access to those spaces during the airport's most operationally demanding period would know with the residual familiarity of a geography absorbed through repeated navigation. She thought about a spade and a short-handled pick carried into the sub-terminal infrastructure of Louisville International Airport on 2 occasions between 2007 and 2015 by a man who was not on any roster and whose credentials had expired with the last legitimate contract work in 2005. She thought about the locked Buick in the long-term parking lot. She thought about the missing keys. She looked at Fenn across the conference room table and said the sub-terminal infrastructure needed to be searched. Fenn said she had submitted the search warrant application to the federal magistrate's court on the previous afternoon, the federal jurisdiction reflecting the airport's status as a federally regulated facility and the necessity of federal authorization for the infrastructure access that the search required. She said the application had been expedited given the case's history and the strength of the preliminary evidence, and that she expected authorization within 48 hours. She said the Transportation Security Administration and the Airport Authority had been notified and were cooperating fully. She said the airport's operational director, a woman named Joan Phipps, who had been in the position for 4 years and who had the institutional memory of the facility's history, but not the personal memory of the 2006 operational period, had provided the complete sub-terminal infrastructure maps from the airport's engineering records and had assigned a senior facilities engineer to assist the investigation team's navigation of the infrastructure once the warrant was in hand. Vera asked whether the infrastructure maps showed any areas of the sub-terminal that were not currently active in the airport's operational functions, areas that had been sealed or decommissioned, or that were used at lower frequency than the main service corridors. Fenn said the maps showed several such areas. She said the airport's terminal had been expanded in 2001 and again in 2009, each expansion having modified the sub-terminal infrastructure in ways that had left certain sections of the original infrastructure in the operational category of retained but low use, sections that remained accessible through the service corridor system, but that were not part of the regular maintenance rotation because the operational equipment they housed had been superseded by the newer infrastructure of the expansion sections. She said the facilities engineer had identified 3 such sections in the original terminal's sub-terminal infrastructure, sections that the regular maintenance rotation visited quarterly rather than daily, and that would therefore have offered, to someone who knew the schedule, extended periods between visits in which activity in those sections would not be observed by the maintenance staff, whose daily presence in the active sections constituted the operational oversight of the sub-terminal environment. 3 sections. In 3 sections of low-use, sub-terminal infrastructure with quarterly visit intervals across 17 years between the Greer disappearance and the present. Vera wrote 3 sections in her notebook and looked at the number and thought about Dallow's letter and the sentence on the folded paper and the single sentence that contained the most important information in the box. The sentence that said the envelope and the drive will tell you who did. The implicit acknowledgement that the envelope and the drive did not tell you everything, that the full account of what had happened to a mathematics teacher and his 14-year-old son on Christmas Eve of 2006 was distributed between what Dallow had been able to document from the outside of the events and what the airport's infrastructure held from the inside. She thought about the warrant application and the 48 hours and the sub-terminal infrastructure maps and the 3 low-use sections and the spade and the short-handled pick and the log entries 8 years apart. She thought about Sandra Greer in Columbus and the school photograph on the mantelpiece. She drove back to her motel and called the detective who had worked the original 2007 investigation review a retired officer named Dennis Cole, who had left the department in 2014 and who had agreed to a phone call when Vera had reached him through the Retired Officers Association 2 days earlier. She asked him about the service corridor observation from the gate agent's statement, whether his review had followed up on it. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had noted it and had checked the contract worker roster for the 2006 Christmas surge and had found no record of the man matching the gate agent's description on the roster, which he had attributed to the gate agent's observation being imprecise rather than to the possibility that the man she had seen was not on any roster because he was not supposed to be there. He said this with the specific quality of a retired professional, acknowledging a failure of reasoning that the subsequent evidence had illuminated in a way that the original context had not. He said he had made the wrong inference from the right observation and that the wrong inference had taken a road that went nowhere and that the right inference would have taken a road that went somewhere and that he had not taken the right road because he had not understood that the right inference was available. Vera said she understood and that the understanding was in the record. He asked her whether they had found something. She said they were looking. He said he would appreciate being told when they found it, and she said she would make sure he was told, and she meant it. The federal warrant authorizing the search of Louisville International Airport's sub-terminal infrastructure was issued on the Friday morning, 39 hours after Fenn's application. The expedited process reflecting both the magistrate's assessment of the preliminary evidence's weight and the specific institutional attention that a federal facility's connection to a 17-year-old missing persons case generated in the federal apparatus. The Transportation Security Administration had been coordinating with Fenn's team and the airport authority since the Wednesday notification and had organized the search protocol around the operational requirements of an active airport. The search to be conducted in the low-use infrastructure sections during the operational windows that minimized the impact on the terminal's ongoing flight schedule. The senior facilities engineer assigned to assist the investigation team was a methodical man named Grant Eves, who had been with the airport authority for 14 years and who knew the original terminal's sub-terminal infrastructure with the comprehensive familiarity of a person who had spent 14 years maintaining it. A familiarity that was not as intimate as Vic Dallow's 9-year supervision familiarity would have been, but that was sufficient to guide the investigation team through the service corridor system to the 3 low-use sections that the infrastructure maps had identified and that Fenn had designated as the priority areas for the initial search. Vera was not permitted inside the infrastructure for the search. The federal warrant's operational protocol specified law enforcement and forensic personnel only, the exclusion of non-essential civilians from the active search area being a condition of the facility access that the airport authority's legal counsel had insisted upon. She was stationed at the base of the service corridor access stairs in the terminal's sub-level with Grant Eves, who had completed his escort function once the investigation team was oriented in the infrastructure, and who waited with her in the specific patience of a facilities professional accustomed to waiting while things happened in the spaces he managed. She asked him about the low-use sections. He described them in the technical vocabulary of airport facilities management, the decommissioned utility conduit junction of the original 1989 terminal construction, and the superseded HVAC distribution section from the pre-expansion infrastructure, and the disused cable management tunnel that the 2001 fiber optic upgrade had rendered non-operational in its original function. He described each section's location in the infrastructure relative to the service corridor network and each section's current access frequency, the quarterly maintenance visit schedule that kept them in the operational record without making them regularly observed. She asked how large the sections were. He said they varied. He said the disused cable management tunnel was the largest, extending approximately 60 feet along the original terminal's north foundation wall at a width of about 12 feet and a ceiling height that varied from full standing height in the central section to 4 feet at the tunnel's terminal ends, where the original construction had followed the foundation wall's angular geometry. He said the tunnel was accessible through a single service door from the main east-west service corridor, a door that was locked on the regular maintenance rotation, but that the key management system would have made accessible to anyone with a valid contract access credential of the type issued to the Christmas surge workforce. He said the door had not been on the rekeying schedule in 2006 because the rekeying schedule had been applied to the active operational sections, and the low-use sections had been excluded from the schedule on the cost management grounds that the security risk of the low-use sections was lower than the active sections, a cost management decision that was operationally defensible in the context of its original rationale, and that the current investigation was suggesting had been an error whose cost was considerably larger than the rekeying cost it had been intended to avoid. He said this with the flat acknowledgement of a facilities professional absorbing the implications of a past decision without the defensive management of those implications that institutional self-protection sometimes produced. He said it directly and without qualification, and Vera appreciated the directness in the specific way she appreciated directness when the subject of it was something that had cost people something irreversible. The search team's radio communications came through Fenn's headset at intervals that Vera tracked from her position at the corridor access stairs, the intervals between communications being the intervals of a search that was systematic and methodical, and that was covering the 3 low-use sections in the sequence of their distance from the access point, the nearest section first, and the disused cable management tunnel, which was the farthest from the access point and the largest, last. The first section, the decommissioned utility conduit junction, was cleared in 40 minutes. The second section, the superseded HVAC distribution area, was cleared in an hour and 20 minutes. The clearance in both cases meaning the absence of the specific indicators that the forensic team was looking for. The subsurface density signatures of the ground-penetrating radar unit that had been brought into the infrastructure in its portable configuration for exactly the purpose of identifying subsurface anomalies in the compacted substrate of the airport's below-grade infrastructure. The third section, the disused cable management tunnel, was entered at 2:17 in the afternoon, and the first radio communication from inside it reached Fenn's headset at 2:53, 36 minutes after entry. Vera was watching Fenn's face when the communication arrived. She had been watching it for 36 minutes in the specific and focused way of a journalist who understood that the face of the lead investigator during a search was one of the most reliable indicators of what the search was producing, the investigator's face being the surface on which the information arriving through the headset registered before the investigator had organized the information into the language of a briefing. Fenn's face at 2:53 registered the communication in the way that it had registered communications from the first 2 sections, the professional composure of a person receiving information and processing it without allowing the processing to become visible on the surface. And then at 2:54, 11 seconds into the communication, something changed in the quality of the composure, not a collapse of it, but a deepening of it, the composure becoming more, rather than less present in the face, in the way that composure deepened when the thing it was composing against was the thing it had been built over 17 years to be ready to compose against. She held the composure for the full duration of the communication, which was 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Then she lowered the headset and looked at Vera and said the ground-penetrating radar had flagged an anomaly in the cable management tunnel's compacted substrate at the section's midpoint, a subsurface density profile at a depth of approximately 3 feet that the forensic team's lead described as consistent with material that had been placed in an excavated and refilled space rather than with the undisturbed substrate of the surrounding tunnel floor. The anomaly's surface dimensions were approximately 6 feet by 2.5 feet. Vera looked at Fenn, and Fenn looked at Vera, and neither of them said anything for the length of time that 6 feet by 2.5 feet required before either of them could say anything, the number having a specific and irreducible meaning in the context of a subsurface anomaly in a sealed section of airport infrastructure that a man with a spade had visited on at least 2 occasions in the years following the disappearance of a father and his son on Christmas Eve. Then Fenn said she was authorizing the forensic excavation of the anomaly and that the state pathologist's office had been on standby since Wednesday and would be notified immediately. She said the excavation would take as long as it required and that the airport authority had been cooperative in extending the operational window for the search, and that she anticipated the authority would extend it further as the situation required. She said she needed to call Sandra Greer in Columbus. Vera said she would wait. Fenn stepped away from the corridor access stairs to make the call in the privacy that the call required, her back to Vera and her voice too low to carry across the corridor's ambient noise. Vera stood at the stairs and looked at the service corridor in front of her, the bare concrete wall and the overhead pipe conduit and the fluorescent lighting of a space designed entirely for function. And she thought about the 31 photographs on Vic Dallow's USB drive, and about a man standing in a corridor like this one at the angle of someone watching something, and about a gate agent who had glanced toward a service corridor door for 3 seconds and had looked away because the departure process had required her attention. She thought about what 3 seconds of not looking at the right moment had meant, and about what 36 minutes of looking at Fenn's face had meant, and about what the 6 feet by 2.5 feet at 3 feet below the cable management tunnel's compacted substrate meant. And she thought about these things in the quiet of a sub-level service corridor in Louisville International Airport on a November afternoon, while the forensic team worked in the disused cable management tunnel 60 feet to her north and the airport above her processed its ordinary traffic with the indifference that very large facilities maintained toward everything happening within their infrastructure that was not part of their primary operational function. She thought about a 14-year-old boy and Powell's books. She thought about the guitar played badly and cheerfully. She thought about a school photograph on a mantelpiece in Columbus, and about a woman who had lived alongside an unresolved absence for 17 years, and who was in the middle of receiving a phone call from a detective lieutenant whose voice was too low to carry across a service corridor's ambient noise, but whose posture communicated everything that a journalist who had been watching investigators make difficult calls for 11 years needed to know about the call's content. She opened her notebook. She wrote the date and the time at 2:54 and the dimensions of the anomaly. And then she looked at what she had written for a moment before she put the pen down, because there were things in the record of an investigation that were not the journalist's record to make first, and that needed the time and the space of the formal process before the journalism built its language around them, and that required the journalist who understood this to recognize when the not writing was the appropriate response to what the investigation had found, and to sit with that recognition in the service corridor until the investigation had done what the investigation needed to do. She put the pen down and sat with it. Fenn returned in 7 minutes. She did not say what the call had contained, and Vera did not ask, because neither of them needed to, and because some things that happened in service corridors during investigations were between the investigation and the families, and were not for the journalism until the families had had the time with the information that the information required. She said the state pathologist was 20 minutes out. Vera said she would be here. They stood in the service corridor together in the functional fluorescence of a space that had been doing its ordinary work for 34 years, and that was now doing something else. Something that its architects had not designed it for, and that its facilities engineers had not anticipated, and that a dying man with Parkinson's disease had spent 8 years documenting in the oblique and incomplete way of someone whose courage had been sufficient for the documentation and not sufficient for the reporting. And they waited in the specific quality of a waiting that both of them understood had been underway for 17 years, and that was now, in a cable management tunnel beneath a Kentucky airport on a November afternoon, approaching the end of itself. The forensic excavation of the cable management tunnel's subsurface anomaly began at 3:40 in the afternoon, and was conducted by a team of 4 specialists under the direction of the state pathologist, Dr. Yolanda Briggs, who had driven from Frankfurt in the 20 minutes that Fenn had estimated, and who arrived at the sub-level access stairs with the composed urgency of a professional who had been on standby for this specific development since Wednesday, and who had organized her preparation for it with the thoroughness that the preparation of a state pathologist for a 17-year-old missing persons excavation required. She was 51 years old and had spent 23 years in the state pathologist's office and had conducted excavations in many environments, outdoor and indoor, rural and urban, in the forensic conditions that Kentucky's varied geography produced. The clay soils of the western bottomlands and the limestone karst of the central plateau, and the compacted fill of urban construction sites and the specific substrate of agricultural land that had been the location for more of her professional work than she had thought it would be when she had entered the field. She had not previously conducted an excavation in the sub-terminal infrastructure of a regional airport, and she had noted this in the way she noted new categories of work as information that was professionally relevant and personally affecting in equal measure, and that needed to be managed in the specific way that professional people managed the things that were both. The tunnel's substrate at the flagged location was compacted gravel fill over the original concrete foundation of the 1989 construction. The layered substrate of a below-grade space that had been built with the drainage and structural management requirements of an airport foundation, and that had been maintained in its structural integrity across 34 years by the airport authority's infrastructure management practices. The anomaly the ground-penetrating radar had flagged was visible in the excavation's early stages as a change in the substrate's character at approximately 18 inches below the surface, the compacted gravel giving way to a disturbed and refilled section whose material differed from the surrounding substrate in the specific way of fill that had been removed and replaced, rather than undisturbed fill that had been in place since the original construction. The excavation proceeded at the pace that the material and the circumstances required, which was not a fast pace and was not intended to be. The forensic team, working with the deliberate and careful methodology of people whose professional obligation to what the excavation might contain required the same care that the contents would require regardless of what the contents were, the care being the appropriate response to the possibility of the contents before the contents were confirmed. Fenn remained at the sub-level access stairs. She had sent her junior detective into the tunnel to observe the excavation and relay communications through the headset, and she had remained at the stairs because remaining at the stairs was where she needed to be, at the point where the investigation's operational management and the investigation's human weight intersected, the point where the detective lieutenant's responsibility for the case and the detective lieutenant's responsibility for the families who were waiting for the case to produce something were both present simultaneously. Vera remained at the stairs with her. They did not speak much across the excavation's duration. There was not much to say that the situation did not already contain more eloquently than either of them could articulate, the situation being the specific and compound weight of a 17-year-old case in the final stages of its resolution in a disused infrastructure section 60 feet down a service corridor from where they were standing while the afternoon passed in the terminal above them, and the flights came and went in the ordinary operations of a regional airport on a November Thursday that was not Christmas Eve, but that was close enough to Christmas Eve in the calendar to carry the specific temporal weight of the approaching anniversary of the morning. A gray Buick had reversed out of a driveway on Birchfield Road, and a retired postal worker had raised his hand at a mailbox and seen a hand raised in return. The first communication from the junior detective came at 4:22. Fenn listened without expression and then said confirmed and instructed the team to continue the careful excavation protocol and to document everything at the standard forensic completeness, regardless of how long the documentation required. She ended the communication and looked at the tunnel's service corridor access door 60 feet north of where she was standing, and she was quiet for the length of time that she needed to be quiet before she turned to Vera and said what the communication had contained. She said the excavation had confirmed the presence of human remains at the flagged location at a depth of 3 feet below the tunnel's compacted substrate surface. She said the preliminary assessment from Dr. Briggs was consistent with 2 individuals, the biological indicators distinguishable at the resolution of the preliminary field examination. She said the formal identification process would require the laboratory work that the state pathologist's office would conduct over the following weeks, and that no formal identification would be possible before that process was complete. She said she was going to call Sandra Greer again. Vera said she understood. Fenn made the call from the same position she had made the previous one, her back to the corridor and her voice too low to carry, and her posture communicating across the 60 feet of fluorescent-lit service corridor what the call contained in the way that posture communicated the things that could not be said in a shared space when the things were the things they were. The call was 9 minutes. When Fenn returned, she said Sandra Greer was driving from Columbus that evening. She said Sandra had a sister in Louisville who she was going to stay with, and that the family liaison officer had been dispatched, and that the notification process was proceeding in the way it needed to proceed. She said there was one more call she needed to make that evening. Vera asked who. She said Martha Vane in Portland, Rowan's sister. The person who had turned the porch light on for a Christmas Eve arrival in 2006 that had never come, and who had been calling the airline and then Rowan's cell phone, and then the Callaway Police Department in the sequence of a person who had understood that something was wrong before the official apparatus had been organized to receive the understanding. She made the call. Vera did not watch it. She turned to face the service corridor in the other direction, the east-west corridor running away from her toward the terminal's operational zones, where the ordinary business of the airport's Thursday continued in its complete indifference to what was happening 60 feet to the north in the disused cable management tunnel. And she stood in the fluorescent light and thought about Martha Vane in Portland, and about the Powell's Books visit that Ellis had been researching for 3 weeks, and about what it meant for the person who had been waiting for something to arrive on a Christmas Eve 17 years ago to receive, on a November Thursday 17 years later, the confirmation that the arrival had never been going to happen, and that the something she had been waiting for was the information that was now reaching her through a phone call from a detective lieutenant in Louisville. She thought about the Dallow letter. "I did not do this, but I knew about it, and I am sorry that I did not say so." She thought about the years between the not saying and the strongbox. The 8 years of photographs and partial logs compiled in the careful and incomplete way of a person who had organized the documentation of a knowledge he could not report into the form that someone else would eventually be able to use. The roundabout courage of a man who had found the courage for the documentation, but not for the delivery of it while he was alive to be held accountable for the not delivering. She thought about what the not delivering had cost Sandra Greer across 17 years, and what it had cost Martha Vane, and what it had cost every person who had known Rowan and Ellis, and who had organized the years of their lives around the absence at the center of the story of 2 people who had put suitcases in a trunk and driven toward an airport, and had not come back. The excavation was completed at 7:40 in the evening, 4 hours after it had begun. The remains were transferred to the state pathologist's transport under the complete documentation protocol that a case of this history required, the documentation being the formal record of the resolution of a 17-year investigation and the foundation of the prosecution that the investigation's full account would eventually support. Dr. Briggs emerged from the cable management tunnel at 7:50 and briefed Fenn at the access stairs with the careful and qualified language of a state pathologist, providing a preliminary field assessment, the language organized around what the field examination could support rather than what it suggested. The distinction between field and laboratory certainty being the distinction that the formal identification process was built around, and that the pathologist maintained with the professional precision of someone who understood that the families deserved the certainty of the laboratory rather than the suggestion of the field, however strong the suggestion was. She said the preliminary assessment was consistent with 2 individuals whose physical characteristics were consistent with the documented descriptions of Rowan Greer and Ellis Greer. She said the consistency of the physical characteristics at the field examination level was such that she was proceeding with the assumption of the identification for the purposes of the investigation's operational management, while making clear that the formal identification required the laboratory process and the DNA analysis that the state pathologist's office would conduct. She said the physical evidence of the burial site was consistent with the site having been used across 2 separate events rather than one, the substrate evidence suggesting that the current state of the site was the result of a primary deposition and a subsequent addition. The 2 events separated by a period whose precise duration the laboratory analysis would help to establish. 2 events. The excavation had produced the evidence of 2 separate interactions with the site, one primary and one subsequent, the subsequent interaction having been the occasion of the second visit that Dallow's log had documented with the notation about the short-handled pick, the visit that had occurred in the years following the initial deposition, and that had produced the substrate evidence of a second disturbed and refilled section adjacent to the first. Vera wrote 2 events in her notebook and looked at the number and thought about what the 2 events communicated about the timeline of what had happened to Rowan and Ellis Greer in the cable management tunnel of Louisville International Airport in the period following the Christmas Eve parking of the gray Buick in the long-term lot, and she thought about this with the full and careful attention it required, and then she wrote below the 2 events notation a line and below the line a single word that she would not use in her journalism until the laboratory had established what the field examination had suggested, and that she wrote in her notebook now because the notebook was where the suggestions lived. The word was together. She wrote it because the two events and their physical relationship in the substrate evidence communicated, at the level of the field assessment's suggestion, the possibility that the two individuals had been brought to the tunnel separately rather than simultaneously, the subsequent addition suggesting that whatever had happened across a duration rather than in a single event, the duration being the most terrible element of the field assessment's suggestion because the duration had a beginning and a progression, and the progression had taken place in a disused cable management tunnel beneath a Kentucky airport, while a maintenance supervisor had noticed the wrong thing and not pursued it, and a gate agent had looked at a service corridor door for 3 seconds and looked away, and a retired postal worker had raised his hand at a mailbox on Birchfield Road, and the flight to Portland had called 2 names twice and received no answer. She did not write anything else in the notebook. She stood at the sub-level access stairs in the functional fluorescence of the service corridor, and she kept the suggestion in the place where suggestions lived until the evidence decided their fate, and she did not allow it to become anything else until it had the support it needed to be something else. She drove to her motel at 9 in the evening and sat at the desk and called her editor. She said the case had reached the point she had been working toward and that the story would be ready when the formal identification was confirmed and not before, and that the confirmation was a matter of weeks and that she would be in Louisville for the full duration. Her editor said she understood and that the story would wait for the confirmation because the story required the confirmation, and anything that didn't have the confirmation was not the story. Vera said yes. She said that was exactly right, and that she appreciated that her editor understood the difference between having the story and having what the story needed before it could be the story. She ended the call and looked at the notebook open on the desk. She looked at the word she had written below the line, and she thought about it for a long time in the motel room's ordinary light while the Louisville November continued its ordinary work outside the window, the city going through its Thursday evening in the complete indifference that cities maintained toward the specific and irreversible things that happened in their infrastructure. And she thought about a father and his son, and Christmas Eve, and an airport, and a cable management tunnel, and 17 years, and a dying man's strongbox, and what it meant for all of it to have arrived, at last, and too late, and also not too late, at the point where the tunnel had given up what it had been holding, and the story could begin to tell what it needed to tell. The formal DNA identification of the remains recovered from the cable management tunnel of Louisville International Airport was confirmed by the state pathologist's office on the 19th of December, 5 days before Christmas, 17 years and 5 days before the Christmas Eve that Rowan and Ellis Greer had not arrived at Martha Vane's house in Portland. The timing was not coincidental in the sense of the date being deliberately chosen for the identification's formal release, but was coincidental in the sense that the laboratory's processing timeline had produced the result when it had produced it, and the result had arrived in the week before Christmas with the specific temporal weight of an anniversary approaching its 18th occurrence, while the formal conclusion of the case the anniversary marked was being delivered through the standard institutional channels of a forensic laboratory's written report. Fenn called Sandra Greer and Martha Vane on the same morning. The notifications conducted in the sequence that the investigation's family liaison structure had established. Sandra first, because she was Ellis's mother, and her primacy in the formal notification sequence reflected both the legal convention of parental relationship and the 17 years that Sandra had spent in the particular hell of a parent whose child's absence had no resolution. Martha second, because she was Rowan's surviving immediate family, and because the notification she received was the notification of a sister whose brother had been carrying her Christmas invitation in the form of 2 airplane tickets when whatever had happened in the cable management tunnel had happened. Vera was not present for either notification. She had been in Louisville for 3 weeks by the date of the confirmation and had established the working rhythm of a journalist in the sustained presence of an active investigation, the daily contact with Fenn, and the regular review of the investigation's documentary development and the ongoing background research into the identity chain that the State Bureau's search unit was still working through. The identity chain had produced 3 names across the 17 years between the contract maintenance work in 2003 through 2005 and the present. The same modification pattern that had appeared in other cases, the investigation had been cross-referenced against. The name at the end of the chain attached to a building trades employment history in a state 300 miles from Kentucky, and to a rental property address in a small town whose most recent occupancy records showed the name as current through 2022. The last year the rental records had been updated before the landlord's subsequent reletting of the property to a different tenant had closed the name's documentary connection to the address. After 2022, the name disappeared from the available record in the same pattern of cessation that each previous name had shown at the point of its shedding, the pattern of a life that had been managing its documentary infrastructure with the conscious intentionality of someone who had learned to move through the formal record of a society's administrative systems with the minimum necessary presence and the maximum possible disposability. Fenn's team had submitted a formal request to the Federal Bureau through the multi-agency coordination framework that the case's connection to federal airport infrastructure had established, a framework that had brought the federal interest of the Transportation Security Administration and the Department of Homeland Security into the investigation's jurisdictional structure, and that had provided the investigation with the federal database access and the interagency coordination that a cross-state identity modification chain required. The Federal Bureau's response had arrived in the second week of November and had produced the finding that the identity chain's endpoint was not the current operational identity, but one name behind the current operational identity, the modification having been made more recently than the State Bureau's search had been able to establish through state-level records alone, and the current operational identity being attached to records in a state that the Federal Bureau's access had required to find. The current operational name, the most recent in the chain, was attached to a building trades employment record in the Ohio-Indiana border region and to a vehicle registration in Hamilton County, Indiana, whose most recent renewal had been in the spring of 2023, and whose associated address was a rural property in the county's eastern farming district, the flat agricultural land of central Indiana that Vera had not been to, and that the investigation's location request, submitted to the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department on the Monday after the DNA confirmation, placed within the operational reach of the coordinated arrest that Fenn had been planning since the Federal Bureau's finding had provided the current location. Vera had asked Fenn in their Wednesday meeting, 3 days before the DNA confirmation arrived, what the investigation understood about the full scope of the case beyond the Greer disappearance, the question that the identity modification chain's geographic range and the building trades employment history across multiple states over multiple decades raised without the investigation having yet formally addressed it. Fenn had said the investigation's current focus was the Greer case and the formal identification and the arrest, and that the question of the broader scope was a question the federal apparatus was better positioned to address than the Jefferson County Department's cold case unit, and that the appropriate answer to the broader scope question was the answer that the multi-agency coordination would produce, rather than the answer that either Fenn or Vera could currently support with the available evidence. She had said this with the careful professional boundary of an investigator who understood that the question was correct and important, and that the correct and important question deserved the full evidentiary support of the investigation that was being built to answer it, rather than the preliminary and potentially inaccurate answer that the current evidence could support in the absence of the fuller investigation. Vera had accepted this. She had been following investigations long enough to understand that the correct and important question and the currently answerable question were not always the same question, and that the discipline of working with what the evidence currently supported, rather than what the implications of the evidence suggested, was the discipline that distinguished the journalism from the speculation, the journalism being the account of what the investigation had established, and the speculation being the account of what the investigation had not yet established, but that the pattern suggested. She wrote the correct and important question in her notebook, under the notation she reserved for questions that were waiting for the investigation to catch up to them, and she left it there while the investigation worked toward catching up. The arrest warrant for the current operational name was executed on the 21st of December, 3 days after the DNA confirmation and 3 days before the 18th anniversary of the Greer disappearance. The Hamilton County Sheriff's Department coordinated with the Federal Bureau and the Jefferson County team for the execution, the coordination reflecting both the jurisdictional requirements of an arrest in a county whose law enforcement had not been party to the investigation and the operational requirement that the arrest be conducted by people with full knowledge of the case's history and the subject's documented pattern of behavior. Fenn drove to Hamilton County on the morning of the 21st and was present for the arrest execution. Vera drove to Hamilton County on the same morning and was present at the perimeter of the rural property address where the county and federal officers had assembled before dawn in the specific operational deployment of a pre-dawn arrest at a rural property. The vehicles staged on the county road out of sight of the property and the coordination conducted by radio in the compressed and functional language of law enforcement at the operational moment. The subject was at the property when the officers made contact at 6:40 in the morning. He came to the door before the knock. Fenn had told Vera this was how it had gone in other cases with other people who had organized their lives around the anticipation of this specific kind of visit, and who had reached, at some point across the years of the anticipation, a relationship with its eventual arrival that was not evasion but something more complex. The complex thing being the management of a moment that had been anticipated for so long that the arrival of it was, in a specific and private way, the arrival of something that had been expected and that the management of the expectation had prepared for. He was 61 years old. He was compact and weathered in the way of someone who had spent decades in physical outdoor work and whose body had been shaped by the work across the years of doing it. He looked at the officers and at Fenn, and he was quiet in the way that certain people were quiet at the moments of their arrest, the quiet of someone who has already moved their interior to the place where the exterior event is going to take them, and who is simply waiting for the exterior to catch up to the interior's movement. He was cooperative, and he did not speak. He was placed in handcuffs and led to the Jefferson County vehicle in which Fenn had driven from Louisville, and he sat in the rear seat with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the middle distance of the Indiana farming country going past the window as the vehicle drove west toward Louisville and the Jefferson County facility where the formal processing of the arrest would be completed. Vera followed in her own vehicle. She drove the rural Indiana roads behind the convoy of law enforcement vehicles in the cold gray of the December morning, the flat agricultural land on both sides of the road in its winter condition, the harvested fields bare and frost white and extending to the flat horizon in every direction, in the specific openness of the Indiana Plains geography that had no interest in concealment and that offered, in its complete and unobstructed visibility, no explanation for how someone had been living in it for 2 years without the investigation finding them sooner. She thought about the identity chain and the building trades and the airport's non-public spaces and the service corridor photographs on the USB drive and the folded letter in the strongbox and the sentence on the piece of paper, "I did not do this, but I knew about it, and I am sorry that I did not say so." And she thought about what the not saying had cost and what the saying, delivered from the distance of death through a strongbox and a hospice social worker and an estranged daughter who had brought it to the right place, had produced. She thought about the cable management tunnel and what it had held for 17 years and what the excavation had found and what Dr. Briggs had said in her careful field assessment language, and she thought about the words she had written in her notebook below the line and about the 2 events and what the 2 events communicated about the duration of the thing in the tunnel, and she kept the word in the private place where it needed to stay until the investigation had built the full evidentiary support for what it communicated. She drove west behind the convoy through the cold Indiana morning toward Louisville and the formal processing and the December that was approaching its 24th and the 18th occurrence of a day that would now be, for the first time in 17 of those occurrences, a day with a formal account rather than a day with a suspended absence where the account should be. She thought about Sandra Greer receiving the DNA confirmation call 5 days before this Christmas. She thought about Martha Vane in Portland receiving hers. She thought about what it meant for the 18th Christmas Eve to arrive in the context of a resolution rather than in the context of an ongoing absence, the resolution being terrible and also not terrible in equal measure. Terrible because of what it confirmed, and not terrible because the confirmation was the thing that made everything after it possible. The grief that had a location and a name and a formal account being a different grief from the grief that had none of those things. Not a lesser grief, but a different one. The different being the difference between a weight that had nowhere to be set down and a weight that could finally, after 17 years, be set down in the specific place it belonged. She drove into Louisville as the winter morning cleared toward midday, and the city received her in its ordinary way, and she followed the convoy to the Jefferson County facility and parked and sat in the car for a moment before going in. The Kentucky December cold and clear outside the car windows and the facility's parking lot ordinary in the way of institutional parking lots and the arrest she had witnessed and the DNA confirmation and the 18 years of the 20th of December and the approaching Christmas Eve all present simultaneously in the specific compound weight of a cold case that had arrived at its resolution. She went inside. The formal processing of the arrest at the Jefferson County facility was completed by mid-afternoon on the 21st of December. The charging documents filed with the Federal District Court in Louisville in the coordination framework that the Transportation Security Administration and the Department of Homeland Security had established as the appropriate prosecutorial structure for a case involving a federal facility and an interstate identity modification chain spanning 17 years. The charges encompassed the Greer case in its full established evidentiary scope and included the supplementary federal charges that the identity chain's geographic extent had generated across the multi-agency coordination. The scope of the charging documents reflecting both the depth of the Greer investigation and the width of the federal apparatus's interest in what the Greer case represented within the larger pattern that the identity chain described. The defendant was held without bail at the federal detention facility adjacent to the district court. The federal detention being the jurisdictional requirement of a case that the federal charging structure had assumed and that the Jefferson County Department's investment in the investigation had led to, but that the federal prosecution would now carry forward through the proceedings that the 21st of December's arrest had initiated. Fenn briefed Vera at the Jefferson County facility at 4 in the afternoon. The briefing organized around what the formal processing had produced in its initial stages and what the investigation's next steps were in the context of the federal prosecution's assumption of the case. She said the defendant had not spoken during the processing beyond the formal responses to the procedural requirements of the booking, the name acknowledgement and the rights advisement, and the standard biographical documentation of the arrest record. She said the federal public defender assigned for the initial appearance had met with the defendant for 40 minutes before Fenn's briefing and had communicated nothing to the investigation because the communication from a defendant to their attorney was not in the category of information that moved in the direction of the investigation. She said there was one exception to the silence. During the transport from Hamilton County, the defendant had spoken once, not to Fenn, who was in the front passenger seat of the vehicle, and not to the driver, who was the Jefferson County deputy who had volunteered for the transport because she had been a rookie in the department when the Greer case was first investigated in 2007, and who had carried it in the way that young officers sometimes carried the first cases they encountered that remained unresolved across the years of their developing careers. The defendant had spoken in the direction of the rear window, his eyes on the Indiana farming country going past in the gray December morning, in the low and unhurried voice of someone making a statement to themselves rather than to the people in the vehicle with them, in the manner of a person who had carried something internal for a long time and who was releasing a portion of it, not to the investigation and not to the journalism, but to the air of the vehicle in the gray Indiana morning and whatever was on the other side of the window that was receiving it. He had said, without preamble and without being asked, that the father had known the building. He had said it once. He had not elaborated and had not been asked to elaborate because neither Fenn nor the deputy had understood, in the moment of the statement, what the statement meant, and by the time the understanding of it had arrived, the moment for the natural response to it had passed, and asking about it directly would have been an interrogative interaction that the defendant's attorney would have objected to, and that the formal processing required to be conducted in the appropriate legal context, rather than in the rear seat of a vehicle on an Indiana County road. Vera looked at Fenn across the briefing table and said the father had known the building. Fenn said yes. Vera said Rowan Greer had been a mathematics teacher at Callaway Regional High. She said she had spent 3 weeks building the background record on Rowan Greer's life and professional history, and that there was nothing in the 16 years of his teaching career or in the 7 years of the single-parent household on Birchfield Road that connected him to Louisville International Airport or to the building trades or to any person whose employment history placed them in the airport's contract maintenance workforce. Fenn said yes. She said the statement was not, as far as the investigation currently understood it, a reference to a prior relationship between Rowan Greer and the airport's physical infrastructure. She said she believed the statement was a reference to something the investigation had not yet established, a reference to what had happened after the parking of the gray Buick in the long-term lot on December 24th, and what Rowan Greer's professional knowledge and intellectual capacity had produced in the specific circumstances of the cable management tunnel. Vera was quiet for a moment. She thought about a mathematics teacher. She thought about the 16 years of classroom work and the patience that his colleagues had described, and the specific professional aptitude of a person who made difficult things legible by the quality of his patience, and who had a gift for seeing the structural logic beneath complex problems and communicating that structural logic to people who could not yet see it themselves. She thought about the cable management tunnel and its infrastructure and its construction and the specific characteristics of its substrate and its ventilation and its dimensions that a person who understood structural logic and who had the patient and analytical mind of someone who had spent 16 years teaching mathematics would have assessed and understood in the way that Declan Marsh in Arizona had assessed the desert structure with the professional knowledge of a landscape architect. She thought about the father had known the building, and about what knowing the building meant in the context of the cable management tunnel, and the two events in the substrate evidence, and the duration that the two events communicated, and about the word she had written in her notebook below the line, and what the word meant in the context of a statement made in the rear seat of a vehicle by a man who had been carrying it for 17 years, and who had released it, once and without elaboration, to the gray Indiana morning. She asked Fenn whether the investigation had a working understanding of the duration that the two events communicated. Fenn said the state pathologist's formal report had provided an estimate that the investigation was treating as operationally reliable pending the full laboratory analysis, an estimate that she was prepared to share with Vera as context for the journalism's understanding of the case's scope, with the qualification that the estimate was a range rather than a specific duration, and that the formal report's language around the estimate was appropriately qualified in the way of forensic science's relationship to evidence whose temporal characteristics were established through the indirect indicators of biological and substrate analysis, rather than through direct documentation. She said the estimate was consistent with a primary deposition in the period immediately following the December 24, 2006 disappearance and a subsequent edition in the period of 2008 to 2012, the subsequent edition being the event that Dallow's log had recorded with the notation about the short-handled pick, and that the substrate evidence had confirmed as a separate interaction with the site following the primary deposition, 2008 to 2012. Vera wrote the range in her notebook. She looked at the range and looked at the word below the line, and she thought about what the range communicated about the duration between the primary deposition and the subsequent edition, and about the father had known the building, and about the structural logic of a mathematics teacher's analytical mind applied to the specific circumstances of a cable management tunnel whose infrastructure he had been given, by whatever terrible logic the situation had produced, the time to understand. She thought about this for the full length of time it required. Then she closed the notebook on the word, and the range, and the statement, and the duration. And she looked at Fenn and said she needed to speak to Sandra Greer when Sandra was ready, and when the family liaison structure confirmed that the conversation was appropriate to the timing. Fenn said she would arrange it. She did not speak to Sandra Greer that week. Sandra was in Louisville with her sister, and she was receiving the forensic confirmation and the formal charging documentation and the family liaison support that the investigation's protocol provided, and she was doing the work of the first week of a formal resolution after 17 years of an unresolved absence, which was the most difficult week of a grief that had been difficult across every week of the 17 years, but that was now difficult in a different way. The way of grief that had a specific account and a specific formal process and a specific location where the weight could now be directed, rather than the diffuse and directionless weight of grief without those things. Vera called Carl Beach instead. She called him from her motel room on the evening of the 21st and told him what the investigation had found and what the arrest had produced, giving him the information that a neighbor, who had been the last person to see two people alive, deserved to have before the public statement that the federal and state public information offices were coordinating for release on the following morning. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said he had waved at that car every December 24th in the 17 years since, and he was going to stop now. He said it with the finality of a man who had found the ritual of the waving inadequate to the thing it was a response to, and who had maintained it not because it was adequate, but because nothing else was available, and that the availability of something else, even something terrible, was better than the unavailability of anything, and that he was going to stop now because the stopping was the right response to the ending of the absence the waving had been for. Vera thanked him and ended the call and sat for a moment in the motel room. She thought about the statement in the vehicle and about knowing the building and about what the father had known and what the knowing had meant, and she thought about Ellis Greer, who had been 14 years old and who had played guitar badly and cheerfully and who had been researching Powell's books for 3 weeks, and she thought about the word below the line in her notebook and about whether the word was a comfort or not a comfort. And she decided it was both simultaneously in the way that certain findings in certain cases were both things simultaneously, and that both things deserved to be held at the same time without one being used to diminish the other. She held them both for the remainder of the evening in the motel room in Louisville, in the December dark outside the window, and then she opened her laptop and began to write because the writing was the next thing, and the next thing was what was required. The federal trial of the defendant, prosecuted under the name from Vic Dallow's letter as the identity confirmed across the full evidentiary scope of the investigation, opened in the federal district court in Louisville in the autumn of 2024, 9 months after the December arrest, and 6 months after the complete forensic laboratory report had been submitted by the state pathologist's office and received by the federal prosecution as the foundation of the evidentiary case that the trial would present. It ran for 19 days. Vera attended every session from the gallery, the second row with her notebook across her knees, in the position she had occupied in every significant trial of her 11 years of cold case journalism, and that had become, across those years, the specific physical posture from which she documented the formal resolution of cases she had spent years following. The posture of a journalist who understood that the gallery of a courtroom was a privileged position from which the full human weight of a case's resolution was visible in a way that no other position in the proceedings provided. The weight present in the families and in the investigators and in the defendant and in the jury and in the specific quality of attention that an institution's formal proceedings generated when the institution was doing the most important work available to it. The federal prosecutor was a young woman named Assistant United States Attorney Brianna Cook, who was 36 years old and who had been assigned the case on the basis of her record in complex federal prosecutions involving institutional crime scenes and multi-jurisdictional evidence chains, a record that her supervisor had determined was the appropriate match for a case whose evidentiary scope included the sub-terminal infrastructure of a federal facility, a 17-year forensic timeline, an identity modification chain spanning 4 states, and the specific institutional failures that the Dallow strongbox had documented across the airport's Christmas surge operational structure. She presented the case in the chronological sequence of its discovery rather than the chronological sequence of its events, the sequence of the strongbox and the USB drive and the photographs and the logs and the subterminal infrastructure search and the excavation and the DNA confirmation and the arrest and the identity chain building the account from the November of 2023 backward to the December of 2006, and then forward again through the 17 years of the evidence's preservation in the cable management tunnel and in the strongbox, the double timeline of the case's commission and the case's discovery running in parallel through the 19 days and producing, in their convergence at the point of the excavation and the DNA confirmation, the specific and irreversible account of what the investigation had established. She presented Vic Dallow's letter on the trial's third day, reading the sentence on the folded piece of paper into the record in the voice of a prosecutor who understood that certain sentences required the full attention of a formal proceeding and who had organized the presentation of the sentence to provide that attention. The sentence read into the record, "I did not do this, but I knew about it, and I am sorry that I did not say so." The courtroom was quiet in the way of a room that has received a sentence requiring quiet before it can be responded to, and the quiet lasted long enough for the sentence to settle into the formal record with the weight of the admission made from death rather than from life, and that carried, in the specific quality of its posthumous delivery, the full account of what Vic Dallow's not saying had cost across 17 years. She presented the 31 photographs from the USB drive in sequence, the earliest of them showing the maintenance uniform and the toolbox and the corridor geography of the sub-terminal infrastructure, and the later ones showing the sharper resolution of improving phone cameras and the same figure in the same spaces across the same years. And then the final photograph, the parking structure photograph, the full-face image in the overhead light of the long-term lot that had produced the facial recognition match and the identity chain connection and the Hamilton County address and the pre-dawn arrest in the December Indiana farming country. She displayed the final photograph on the courtroom screen without narrating it, and let the jury look at it for the duration that a full-face photograph in the parking structure of a long-term lot required to communicate what it communicated, which was the specific and terrible irony of a photograph taken in the long-term lot of Louisville International Airport, the same long-term lot where a gray Buick LeSabre had sat locked with Christmas presents in its trunk from December 24th through December 27th of 2006, while the airport above it processed its holiday traffic with the institutional indifference of a large facility toward the specific and irreversible things happening within its infrastructure. She presented the forensic evidence of the cable management tunnel on the trial's 7th day, Dr. Briggs providing testimony in the careful and qualified language of a state pathologist describing a forensic excavation and its findings and the laboratory analysis that had produced the formal identifications and the duration estimate, and the two-event substrate evidence and the physical characteristics whose consistency with the documented descriptions of Rowan and Ellis Greer was confirmed at the confidence interval the evidence and the methodology supported. Fenn testified on the trial's 9th day, her 19 days of testimony covering the full investigative record from the strongbox delivery to the arrest, the methodical and sequential account of an investigation that had moved from the single sentence on the folded piece of paper to the formal identifications and the arrest in the period between November and December of 2023, with the pace and the thoroughness of an investigator who had been waiting 16 years for the development that would allow the case to move, and who had moved it with everything she had when the development arrived. The defendant did not testify. His attorney, a federal public defender named Morris Tate, who was experienced and diligent and who had conducted the defense with the professional integrity that the representation of a client in these circumstances required, made the decision against testimony with the defendant's agreement. The agreement communicated to Tate in the quiet and unhurried manner of a defendant who had already determined the appropriate relationship to the proceedings and who implemented that determination consistently across the full 19 days, without the variation or agitation that the duration of a trial sometimes produced in defendants who had not reached the same settled relationship to their proceedings. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and 40 minutes, and returned on a Friday afternoon in October with verdicts on all counts. Guilty across the full scope of the federal charges, the verdicts read by the court clerk in the formal cadence of a federal proceeding and received by the gallery in the specific silence that the resolution of a 17-year-old case produced in the people who had come to the courtroom carrying the 17 years of the case's weight, and who were now in the moment of that weight being formally transferred from the suspended territory of the unresolved to the definitive territory of the established. Sandra Greer was in the gallery. She sat in the row behind Vera, close enough that Vera could hear her breathing in the specific quality of very controlled breathing across the reading of the verdicts, the breathing of a woman who had arrived at this specific courtroom on this specific Friday afternoon from 17 years of a particular form of living that was about to change in the way that verdicts changed the quality of living for the people for whom the verdict was not an abstract institutional outcome, but the formal conclusion of something that had reorganized everything about their lives from the moment it began. She did not cry when the verdicts were read. She sat in the specific composure of a person who has organized themselves for a moment across a very long preparation, and who, when the moment arrives, finds that the preparation has done its work, and that the composure is real rather than performed, the composure that is the outward form of an interior adjustment that has been underway for longer than anyone can see. After the verdicts, in the gradual dispersal of the gallery, she and Vera sat beside each other in the emptying courtroom for a few minutes. Sandra had agreed to a conversation with Vera for the book in the weeks following the arrest, and they had spoken 3 times before the trial. Each conversation building the specific trust that such conversations required, and that Vera's consistency and directness had produced across the months of contact. The conversation in the emptying courtroom was not one of those structured conversations. It was something else, the conversation that happened in the space between the formal proceedings and the ordinary world outside the courthouse. The conversation that was not journalism and was not therapy, but was the specific human exchange of 2 people sitting in a room where something significant had just happened and who were both aware of what the significance cost. Sandra said she thought about the guitar. Vera said she understood. Sandra said Ellis had been terrible at the guitar in the specific way that 14-year-olds who had recently taken up the guitar were terrible at it, without concern for the terribleness, playing with the cheerful unself-consciousness of someone who was doing something because they wanted to do it rather than because they were good at it, and that the cheerfulness of the terribleness had been one of the things she had loved most about him in the way that parents loved the specific and unrepeatable qualities of their children's characters that were most fully themselves and most fully the child rather than the child in progress. She said she thought about it because the cheerfulness was the thing she missed in the most precise way, the way she missed the specific quality of a specific person rather than the general weight of the absence, and that the specific quality of the cheerful terribleness at the guitar was the most vivid of the specific qualities she carried because it was the most purely Ellis of the qualities, the quality that was most completely him without any overlay of the growing up that had not happened, and that she could therefore hold without the grief of the what might have been that the other memories sometimes carried. Vera listened and did not write anything. She kept the guitar in the place in her understanding of Ellis Greer where it had been since Sandra had first described it in their initial conversation in November, and she held it alongside the Powell's book's research and the mathematics and the biological indicators of the substrate analysis and the 2 events, and the father had known the building and she held all of it together in the compound weight of a case that she had been following for 3 months and that Sandra Greer had been following for 17 years. The sentencing was conducted 6 weeks after the verdict. The federal judge delivered 4 consecutive life terms in the language of federal sentencing, measured and without theatrical augmentation, the language of an institution applying its full formal weight to the marking of something that the institution's formal weight was the appropriate instrument for marking, and that the judge had understood, in the 19 days of the trial that preceded the sentencing, required the full weight and not the performed version of it. The defendant received the sentencing in the settled and interior manner he had brought to everything across the proceedings, his hands flat on the defense table and his eyes on the middle distance of the courtroom's middle register, and his face presenting the neutrality that had organized itself across the years into the specific surface quality of someone for whom the interior life had been sufficient company across a very long time, and who had found, in the proceedings and the sentencing and the institutional conclusion of the case, no reason to revise the organization that had sustained the interior across the years. He was led from the courtroom. Martha Vane attended the sentencing. She had flown from Portland for it, the only proceeding she had attended in person, having followed the trial through the daily coverage from a distance that she had determined was appropriate to her participation in the institutional resolution of her brother's case, and that she had maintained consistently until the sentencing, for which she had determined that her presence was the appropriate response and that the distance was not. She was 68 years old. She had the specific quality of a woman who had organized a long grief without being organized by it, the quality of someone who had decided that the grief was part of the life rather than the whole of it, and who had maintained that decision across 17 years with the discipline that such decisions required when they were tested by the recurring weight of anniversaries and legal proceedings and the periodic resurfacing of a case that had never been fully submerged. She spoke with Vera after the sentencing in the courthouse corridor, briefly and with the directness of someone who had one specific thing to say and who said it once and clearly. She said she had been making Rowan's favorite Christmas Eve dinner every year since 2006, the specific meal that Rowan had always made on Christmas Eve before the airport drive, and that she had taken on the making of after the airport drive never happened, not as a commemorative ritual in the formal sense, but as the continuation of a practice that had belonged to Rowan, and that she had decided deserved to continue in the absence of him continuing it. She said she was going to make it again this year. Vera said she was glad. Martha said she thought Rowan would have found the formal proceedings satisfying in the specific way of a mathematics teacher, the way of someone who found in the formal establishment of a complete and verified account the same satisfaction that a complete and verified proof produced, the satisfactions being analogous in the quality of their completeness, the account and the proof both having the property of being fully established rather than partially established, and both deriving their value from the completeness rather than from any quality of their content. She said she thought Ellis would have found it less satisfying and more human, and that this was also appropriate because Ellis had been 14 years old, and 14-year-olds were more human than their fathers in the way of people who had not yet learned to find satisfaction in completeness for its own sake. She smiled when she said this, the smile of a woman who was carrying something irreversible and who had found, across the years of carrying it, the specific capacity to smile at the memory of the thing that was irreversible alongside the grief of its irreversibility, the two things coexisting in the way that time and the sustained practice of living alongside loss sometimes allowed them to coexist. Vera drove back to her motel after the sentencing through the Louisville December that was 4 days from Christmas and that carried, in the specific quality of December in a city where the case had begun and had now concluded, the weight of what December meant in the account of a father and his son who had left a house on Birchfield Road 18 years earlier on a cold, clear morning with the frost on the lawns and the Buick's exhaust steaming and a retired postal worker's hand raised at a mailbox. She thought about the sentencing, and about Martha's dinner, and about Sandra's guitar, and about Carl Beach, who was not going to wave at the Birchfield Roadhouse on Christmas Eve this year, and about a gate agent who had glanced at a service corridor for 3 seconds in 2006, and about Vic Dallow's deteriorating hand assembling the photographs and the partial logs across 8 years into the organized evidence of a knowledge that his courage had managed to document and not to deliver, and that death had delivered on his behalf to an estranged daughter who had brought it to the right place. She thought about the maintenance supervisor's sentence on the folded paper and about what sorry meant in the specific context of a man whose sorry had arrived 17 years after the point at which the sorry, had it arrived then, would have meant something different. The sorry of a man who had understood the difference and had carried the understanding across the 17 years of the distance between the sorry he had been capable of and the sorry that the situation had required, and that the distance between the two was the cost that Sandra Greer and Martha Vane and Carl Beach and Dennis Cole and Donna Marsh and every person who had known Rowan and Ellis Greer had paid across the years without ever knowing they were paying it against a debt that existed in a dying man's private account. She pulled into the motel parking lot and sat in the car for a moment in the December night. The Louisville Christmas lights were on in the surrounding streets in the specific way that Kentucky City Christmas lights were on in mid-December, generous and unambiguous in their seasonal declaration, and the motel's parking lot was lit in the functional and indifferent manner of parking lots, and the December dark above it held the particular quality of a clear, cold night in the upper South that was close to Christmas but not yet Christmas, the night before the approach of the approach.